Hello, everybody. This is Scott in the system, and sorry it's been away a while, but our guest today is Leslie Crawford,
Liesha. It's Liesha.
Liesha Crawford, pardon me,
Nope, that's okay. Everybody says it wrong.
yeah, and your title exactly is.
Well, my students called me the evil supreme ultimate world commander, oh marvelous one, goddess of room 108. But I was a special educator for 37 years.
Uh, oh, yeah. Well, if you could just take us from the beginning and tell us how you'll cultivate it through this career. Go ahead.
Well, I guess it started back almost when I was born, because I used so many things that happened to me as a child um, to be a successful teacher. And my mother was a teenage mother. And I like to tease her that I was a graduation night celebration. And so she was a single teenage mom. She, of course, had to get married back in the 60s. I'm 63 years old. I have no problem saying that. And my biological father landed himself in prison when I was very young for back in the 60s, doing drugs, dealing drugs, forging prescriptions, selling the drugs. And so we had to move in with my grandparents. And basically, if you ever watched the old Andy Griffith show, I grew up in Mayberry. I grew up in a small town north of here. My grandparents were the sheriff and the matron of the Newaygo County Jail back in that time. And we moved in with them. So I lived in a jail.
Oh,
You walked through my, yep, you walked through my grandma's kitchen and were you passed through a kitchen and you were in the radio room of the jail where the radio police sat there on one side and in behind them were the drunk tanks of the jail. So that was my and my cousin's first playground.
really?
Yes.
I've
And
never heard of a sheriff using their own property as the holding area for criminals.
yeah, well, it wasn't his property, it was the county property. And if you
Oh,
Google vintage Newaygo County Jail, you could see a picture. And there's a house and it's you look at it and oh, there's the bathroom, there's the bedrooms, there's my grandma's living room, there's the kitchen, and behind it you see barred windows, a hallway with barred windows. Those were the jail cells.
oh.
And just like the Andy Griffith show, it was complete with here's all the rifles hanging on the wall with a board over them. And that's where I grew up. And I like to joke that my grandfather was a very big man. He was very quiet. And he, but everybody was afraid of my grandmother, who was not even 5 foot tall. And she was one of the first women police officers in Michigan. And so that kind of started this whole process of, okay, I can be badder than you. And that really helped me as I grew through my teaching career. And so back then, then of course, we fast forward to the 70s, and I was 16. And if you had a certain GPA, you could take an hour instead of a study hall, and you could go to the elementary school and work in a classroom. And they selected me for a kindergarten class. And I was working in there, and one day the teacher brought this little boy to me, and she said, "Here, you work with him. He can't do anything anyway."
So therefore, that teacher already, you know, shut him off, I guess, or isolated him from the rest of the classroom. I would.
Correct. Yes. And I remember thinking, wow. Now, I hadn't had any exposure to people with disabilities, especially learning disabilities. He could walk. And so I said, okay. So I sat down and we were making pumpkins. I remember this just like it was yesterday. And this would have been in like 1970, 78, 70, 77. I was a sophomore. And I graduated in 1979. And we were making jack-o'-lanterns. And so I sat with him and we made this jack-o'-lantern and he did it. He was so proud. It looked awful, but he had done it. And he was so proud of what he had done. And I remember thinking, this boy needs help. He needs more help than he's getting in this classroom in 1977. Now, you have to remember that special education laws did not come into place until about 72.
Yeah. That was section 504.
PL 94142.
Oh, okay.
It was a federal law that put into place that 504 came later.
Oh,
PL 94142, we had to memorize that in college.
oh,
Was that the federal law put into place that any student, regardless of any disability, must be educated at public expense. And if you read the book, The Memory Keeper's Daughter, it really explains a lot of that. It's not a fiction, but it's based upon a true story. And it talks about the fight the parents had to get that law into place.
I wonder how much bearing that had on my own folks, being I'm 57.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Greenville, so
Okay, yeah.
it's not much bigger than the Wago, if any.
Yep. I was in White Cloud, even smaller. So I remember thinking that young man, I could still see his face as plain as day, and this was 47 years ago. And I really hated the way the teacher treated him. So I went to my high school counselor who placed us and said, I don't want to be in that classroom anymore.
Yeah. Now,
And
can we say that was probably because that teacher was undereducated, probably? Like,
I'm thinking, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
she was undereducated, knowing how to deal with it. Because,
I I agree. I think it was the law was so new and it was so overwhelming that yeah, and she would have come from a time where they didn't teach teachers how to work with these kind of students. My own grandmother was a one-room schoolhouse teacher, and after many years after I became a teacher, she said to me, I used to have students that couldn't learn the same as everybody else, but I was so sad I didn't know how to teach them. This would have been in the 1920s and 1930s.
yeah.
And so I asked the counselor to change classes. I said, I don't want to be there watching how she treats this child. And so he put me into a third grade class, which worked out good. But I remember a few months later, I was going to the third grade class every day, seeing this young man, and he was holding onto a rope with a knot, and he was with the special education teacher. And I remember thinking, I was right. He didn't belong there. He needed more help. And he had been transferred to a special education class. Now, I don't know the procedure for how that would have happened back in 1977, but I remember those feelings. I remember that feeling of, wow, I was right about that kid. He's going to get the help he needs. And that's what started it at 16 years old.
Okay. Okay.
And so it was so profound. I can see that kid's face. I can still see his pumpkin that he made and that feeling that I had. And I still get this little tingly feeling when I talk about it
Did
that,
did
mhm.
you ever have any interaction with that student thereafter, or?
No, nope, I never
Oh,
did.
okay.
Except to see him in the hall hanging onto a rope with a knot where all these kids in this special needs class had to hang on to walking down the hall.
Okay.
And that was it.
I don't quite see the purpose of that, but okay.
Well, I don't know. My mind was they were afraid that they would get lost or wander off or,
Oh, they were all hanging on to the same one.
yes, they were all hanging onto the same rope, walking down the hall following the teacher.
Oh,
It
it's
could have been to teach them to walk in a line. I don't know, So
oh,
I prefer the path of positivity that, hopefully
yeah,
it's teaching
yeah,
them not to
yeah,
wander off and things like that.
yeah. Okay,
So that's what started the whole thing.
okay.
And it just, you could see that 47 years later, it still was profound to me to make that decision. And it was never, my family was not college oriented. I was not encouraged to go to college. And so the next summer, when I was 17, I went to Europe for a summer. And the family I stayed with, all their children were expected, they have 5 kids, were expected to go to university. And I came back and went, this is 4 months later. And I said, I want to do that. So I applied to college without my parents' knowledge. And I applied to Northern Michigan University for physical therapy. I applied to Aquinas College for regular education, elementary school, and I applied to Western Michigan University for special education, physically and otherwise health impaired, that program, which is not in existence anymore. And so I got accepted to all three, but I chose Western because it was far enough away my parents couldn't come visit me. Where Grand Rapids, they could still see me. My grandfather said, too darn far for you to go to Northern. So okay. So I chose Western.
Was the reason you wanted to be that far away? You just wanted separation, I guess.
Yep. I didn't want my parents to keep showing. I knew in Grand Rapids they would keep showing up.
Oh,
And it was my mom and my stepfather at the time. And I didn't want them to keep showing up and sticking their nose in what I was doing. But Kalamazoo was 2 hours away or more. And I had to come home by bus to Grand Rapids and then catch a ride with a friend's dad to White Cloud. So I knew they wouldn't come visit me that often.
yeah.
So, yeah, and the physically otherwise health impaired, the way Western had one of the best programs in the country at that time for special education. It's still very, 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 very high up there. And the way it worked was you started out in special ed, but you automatically, as you saw in my resume probably, you automatically had a degree in elementary education. And so the physically and otherwise health impaired, that was a certification for to work with children who missed a lot of school because of health problems, who needed people to understand the physicality of their disability. So we actually took medical classes to understand cerebral palsy, to understand spina bifida. I had diabetics in my class who missed a lot of school because we were also expected to provide homebound services for these students that were on our caseload. Um, and so we had to understand the medical stuff behind these disabilities. We had to understand how to help them go to the bathroom and all this stuff that it was crazy what we had to learn. And so I'm working toward that. And as I started getting toward the end, I had a minor in elementary education, so I had a certification in that. I was also taking French classes, so I actually have a minor teaching certificate in French and music because I was really into music. I played in the symphony, I played in the band down there, and marching band. And so I also had a minor in music. So I get to my senior year and I'm meeting with my advisor, and he goes, oh, you need one more class to be able to graduate. He goes, but if you take it in working with people with cognitive impairments, which back then was called mental retardation, back then, and he said, if you take one class and do a short student teaching, you'll have another certification, which I would have left college with 5 certifications.
Hello, my name is Scott and I have lived independently now for 30 years with cerebral palsy. Thank you for visiting my channel Scott in the System. I have a podcast by the same name. I talk to mostly nonprofit services for the disabled community. I also like to talk about being an entrepreneur affiliate marketer. If you would like to be on my podcast, you can email me at scott@scottinthesystem.com. Be sure to visit my website as at www.scottinthesystem.com. Please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel as well. Thank you for dropping by and have a blessed day.
So I said, okay. So I took that class, I graduated, I did a student teaching as a graduate student, and I came away from Western with 5 teaching licenses
Wow.
in Michigan. So that's kind of where I ended up doing this.
So, and you started where out it exactly?
Well, at first I was substituting in Kalamazoo because I had met my now husband, and I always tease him. I said I had planned to move to Alaska, and I had my teaching back then. Western's program was so good that it had reciprocity. You could reciprocate any teaching license from Western and Michigan would go to any state. I could have went any state, and they would say, "Oh, you're from Michigan, no problem." And
Oh,
so I had made arrangements to move to Alaska. I met my husband my junior year of college. And I met him, excuse me, and he says, "Oh, you're moving to Alaska? I see no sense in pursuing this relationship then." I'm like, "Well, maybe I need to rethink that. So after I graduated, I was living in this little tiny house trailer in the Loop in Kalamazoo, right at Stadium Drive in Ashtamo. There was like a loop to get on the freeway, and there was a house trailer park there, and I had this little tiny 1-bedroom house trailer, and I started substitute teaching in Kalamazoo. And I did that for, I don't know, about a month. And Grand Rapids Public Schools came to me and said, "Hey, we see you are a POHI teacher," which is the physically and otherwise health impaired. It was always put into POHI. Special ed teachers, as you know, speak in acronyms.
that's what they called my classroom when I was at Bush.
I bet they did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And they said, "We need a teacher for the remainder of the school year at Mary Free Bed." They said the teacher decided to retire the first month of school, and we need somebody there. And I'm like, okay.
That wasn't very nice.
Yeah. And it happens more than you think. And so I said, okay. So I started driving Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids every day. But they also hired a speech therapist who was living in Kalamazoo that I knew. And so her and I would trade off driving. And so here I am at Mary Free Bed, and they said, "First year teacher, fresh out of college." And they said, "Okay, they didn't leave you any records. We don't know what she was doing, but you figure it out."
Oh, goodness.
I'm like, "Okie dokie then." And I guess that's what started my attitude to, if you're going to do this to me, you had better let me do it my way, or I'm not staying. And it carried me through for 37 years. And so what happened then at Mary Free Bed is that it was a one room, and there was actually an interview with me from WZZM about this program. And the kids that were at Mary Free Bed for rehab would come from, they were all over the state. And it was my job to teach them while they were there, but coordinate with their schools also, so that when they returned to school, they wouldn't have lost so much. So here I am on the fly learning to write IEPs, learning that back then they used, I think it was the Washtenaw objectives. And my principal is trying to help me, guide me through that. And I'm teaching first through 12th grade. And it was rotating all the time as to who was in my class because they would leave, they would go back to their home schools, and then I'd get another one. So it was always rotating. What was happening? And I did have one student from Indiana too, which was interesting because I ended up teaching in Indiana later in life. So I did that for a year. I really, really enjoyed it. And then yeah, go ahead.
I just was gonna say, I never knew even doing rehab at Murray Free by myself as a kid. I never knew they had, schooling there as well, part of the program.
Yes, it used to be part of Grand Rapids Public Schools, and then Mary Freebed took it over. I don't know when, but then the teacher became a Mary Freebed employee.
Oh,
And this would have been in 1984, fall of 1984. And so I really liked it. And because of the way the system worked with teacher contracts, if you were hired um, after the school year, you were given a temporary contract, which expired at the end of the school year. And then what they did is they put it up for bid, and any teacher could come in and bid on that class and take your job.
oh, that's lovely.
Yeah. And then being a first year teacher, you got whatever was left. So I'm like, okay, well, let's see. I got student loans to pay, and well, what do I do now? And so I happened to notice that as the school year was winding down, that Lincoln campus out on Crahan, just past Meyer Gardens there, on
Oh,
Crahan and Bradford. There's a whole campus out there, and that has its whole own history. But there were three schools, but now there's two schools out there, and one of them is for severely and profoundly handicapped students, which is where I did a lot of teaching recently. And the other one was for, at the time, it was called Trainable, but now it's called Educable. And maybe, they were probably 5 to 26 years old, but functioned maybe at a 5, 6, 7 year old level. They couldn't function in regular ed, but they needed job skills, they needed this. And then the third school at the time was KVO, which is where students would go to get job training. And it's since been closed and transferred. So I noticed they had a summer teaching position opened at the higher level school. So I'm like, okay, so I applied for it. So I taught the summer out there. And as I'm watching the jobs come up for the fall, I was like, hey, here's one at Lincoln Developmental right next door with the severe and profoundly impaired students. So I applied for it and I got it. And so I was a second year teacher. And here I get thrown from Mary Freebed to this. And I was there for a year. And it's kind of funny because I went back like 30 years later, and some of the people I worked with in 1984 were still there.
yeah.
And so it was kind of funny to see that. And then other friends I made that second year, I would run into periodically as we all moved around the system. And so then I knew I was getting married to this guy that didn't want me moved to Alaska. And so I resigned from there at the end of the school year and at the end of the summer because that program goes 365 days a year. It goes all year round. And
Oh,
those students go all year round in both of those schools. And by law, they have to provide them all year round. And they have to have an IEP that states they need that. But once they have that IEP, then they go year round. And again, it was orchestrated by Grand Rapids Public Schools. Kent ISD now owns it. But at the time, Grand Rapids Public Schools had control of it. And so I resigned. And now remember, I've worked with physically disabled, and now I've worked with severely disabled, both cognitively and physically. So my husband and I move because he gets a job in Toledo, Ohio.
okay.
And there is nothing in Grand Rapids Public Schools that compares to where I taught in Toledo, Ohio. And again, it was the same system. I was substituting until they found out where they had an opening. um, because it was the same system in Ohio, where somebody resigned and I was substituting. Oh, we got to wait for it to all fall out. And oh, by the way, you're going to be at Stewart Elementary. Okay. And Stewart Elementary was a small inner city school, and you were followed in and out by the gangs until they knew who you were. There's nothing in Grand Rapids that even begins to compare. I walk in for the interview, this tiny little lady principal, 250 kids in the building. And it was for a classroom of emotionally impaired, learning disabled students. But because I had special education certification, not in those areas, but since I was coming from Michigan, they knew that I had some experience there. So she looks me right in the eye and she says, "They've run out 7 teachers in 2 years. What are you going to do?"
What did they mean by that? They just couldn't deal with it?
Right. The kids were so bad and they were so behavior problems that the teachers just left 7 of them within 2 years. And that was the only question I was asked in the interview. And I looked her in the eye and I said, "Stay?" What was I supposed to say? So I was there 3 years with these students. And they were a rough group. But again, growing up in a jail really helps you. And one of my favorite stories is I would have a student that would come to me and say, "My daddy's so mad at you. When he gets out of prison, he's going to come kick your butt." He used a different word. And I'd say, "Well, you know what? Maybe he's my daddy's roommate." Because my father was in prison also. Not at the time, but they didn't need to know that. And then they come a few days later, "My granny, she gonna come kick your butt. She's so mad." And I said, she can talk to my granny. My granny carries a gun and has a badge. And then I say, and I'd use the finger thing, I say, "Before you go any farther, until you've been brought to school in a police car, we have nothing to talk about." I didn't tell them it was because my mom's car died and my grandfather had to take us. Shut them down a little bit. And they'd just go, "Hmm." And because I'd had so many of the same experiences that these guys had had, we were able to connect.
You
And
were able to get to their level, I guess.
and I was not afraid to come down to their level. Now, don't get me wrong, I was scared to death going from Mary Free Bed and Lincoln Developmental Center to this.
But you can't show it.
Exactly. And that's what I tell people. I've mentored many teachers, and they're like, "What do you do?" And I said, "You never ever show how scared you are. And you have to be prepared to be more bad than they are and worse behaved sometimes. And it really does you well. But you can never show them that you're scared." And so I did that for 3 years before my husband got a new job.